Hello everyone, today we talk about the Latin Empire of Romania. After having made a video on its military organization, we'll come back on this entity again. Of course, this is just like a broader introduction, mostly concentrated in the first part, at the very beginning of the Latin Empire. So, you know what we're talking about here, it's, post Constantinople's conquest. So we won't dwell on that dynamic that we'll discuss another time. But we start from the Treaty of March 1204. That actually was before the fall of the city. Among the Crusaders, the Fourth Crusade, mostly the French and the Venetians. This was a charter constituting sort of fact of constitution proper of the Latin Empire. In fact, when Constantinople was taken, it served for the formation of the new statal organism instituted by the winners. So the state that was constituted had an eminently feudal character. We will see how they would split it fundamentally, because it was in terms of land power a French replica, in a sense, Frankish feudalism, Western Frankish feudalism in these broader territories, while the Venetians refused basically the continental side and preferred to maintain some strongholds for their maritime dominion, which was a clever move. But as we will see here, the events of the Latin Empire were, crippled since the beginning in a way. This also brought to important consequences for the same survival of what would remain the Roman Empire under the Palaiologoi, because the Nicaeans, that from which, as you know, the most of the Roman forces were transferred. Eventually, there was this other principalities created. We'll look at in a while, but those would be the ones who would come back and reconquer Constantinople at a point. But there was a moment in which, in the very beginning, 1205, where they were risked to be wiped out by the Latins, and this would have changed world history forever. But the Bulgarians are Kaloyan thought better that, and in a sense, in spite of the enmity between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians at some level, that victory achieved at Adrianople over the Latins saved the same empire and made it survive other 2 centuries and a half in inside. But everything, and that's why we will talk about this in greater detail at some point, was extremely unstable. But things could go in very different directions. So to the we have assessed this feudal character that in the Byzantine Empire fundamentally had not existed, as at least by Western Frankish standards. The pronoia system was the consequence of the large privatization of assets, of landed properties of these major magnates that controlled, at the end of the day, the countryside and so on. But it was never as decentralized as the Western model. This is not actually here I won't digress on the problem of centralization, decentralization. I mean, even Western feudalism had a gluing factor that objectively in this broader picture was successful. I mean, the West basically wiped out the Roman Empire in the circumstance, and there is a broader. Magdaleno wrote about this stuff, about his work on Manuel the First Comnenus, a beautiful book. I just recalled it multiple times in these videos because I studied an exam for it, and it shows how objectively the same gifted emperors like Manuel was had realized, in a sense, the advantages of Western feudalism over a reality that tended, let's say, in a reactionary sense, in Constantinople to remain, let's say, it's almost paradoxical, more centralized, but more centralized not much in the sense that they didn't wish to achieve private clienteles, but rather that would try to keep standing just this public, immediately statal reality as in Roman times, but this might also have brought to its consequent decline, as the West at this point had reached and in a sense surpassed the East, in a broader sense. The Fourth Crusade is the proof of this aspect at so many political and social levels, even before the military ones. But this is a wholly different topic we will discuss on another occasion. For now, we stress the institution of a feudal order, however, with the election of a Latin emperor proper, right? And to this end was summoned a commission formed by 6 Venetians and 6 Crusaders that appointed the Count Baldwin of Flanders, on which also the Venetian votes converged, plausibly in order to avoid that the strong personality of Boniface of Montferrat could impose himself in this scenario. Even here there is a political background that maybe we'll discuss better on another occasion. Immediately afterwards was also instituted a Latin Patriarch of Constantinople in the person of the Venetian Tommaso Morosini. The Treaty of March 1204 contemplated, in fact, to entrust the Patriarchy to the side that from which would have not the emperor would have not been chosen, so splitting the privilege in the prerogative in that sense, and therefore after this agreement the empire was practically partitioned in a feudal sense. The Latin sovereign proper, so the imperial authority, that Constantinople itself was already, let's say, constituting sort of state within the empire itself since the last centuries because of problems of provincial revolts and so on. So that was also infrastructurally well served. It was a centrality of Constantinople that, aside from Thessalonica, was basically the true only city proper. It was massive also for those time standards, and represented literally a state on its own. So the Latin emperor obtained one fort containing Constantinople, Thrace, that is next door, and part of Asia Minor and some Aegean islands. The rest was split in different parts among the Venetians and the Crusader Knights. The partition had, however, a largely theoretical value when it was accomplished. That was fundamentally in September of 1204, because the Byzantine province, broadly meant, had yet to be subjugated. I mean, the same Roman Empire had been about that. I mean, the centrality of Constantinople properly as the city, as we've seen, and its fundamentally maritime dimension, and a provincial hinterland that even, in geographically very close places from the main, maritime centers was substantially different from an historical point of view, and where naturally the private landowners stayed with their clienteles, with their private armies and so on. Macedon and Thrace, however, were conquered by Baldwin of Flanders with a short, brief summer campaign. That these were kind of the easiest provinces to conquer, and even when afterwards the subjugation took place, not always the assignations that had been made on the charter matched with the actual acquisitions, both for the further agreements occasionally occurred among the winners that modified in certain cases the spheres of influence, both because naturally of the resistance of the Greek elements that often prevented the Latins to subjugate some regions. So, of course, you can imagine all kind of, even here, fragmentation, complication. Here, the biggest picture one should keep in mind is that the conquest of Constantinople brought to a major collapse, right? When you have a huge statal entity that has been working, I mean, you can't choose the Byzantine Empire, but there are other entities, maybe even it's not so centralized. I mean, pick this time the Kingdom of Sicily, Kingdom of France. At this point, Germany had kind of never been united proper, but had entered in crisis after, you know, the contraction of the Hohenstaufen power. So there is a moment of privatization. That is to say, lack of central authority, everybody immediately starts to do whatever the heck they like, because nobody gives a damn about the whole thing. They only care about their own personal gain, or at least even when they, of course, manage to do things collectively, they still don't have the means by the beginning of the 13th century to impose, a centralized, uniform rule. This is with this Crusader wave, the empire, these lands, Byzantine lands, get feudalized in part, and this entails all the decentralization, even the impossibility of drawing precisely even the various boundaries of having an idea. I mean, it's an areas of spheres of power, of influence, and it keeps floating like that. And naturally, everything collapses. Like, you know, when everything was held together, now everything collapses. Everybody locally takes matters in their own hands, and therefore this disrupts also that, you know, broader structural system that had been before. So 1204 was a major blow to the empire in that sense. Not only Constantinople was sacked and when ruined partly, it was emptied, but when the Ottomans arrived in 1453, they didn't find much left of what had been the grandeur of the Byzantine Empire. Let's say the Crusaders, the Frankish one, had a bit of problems to handle the thing. They also destroyed a freaking lot. They left the king a lot of stuff because they didn't have the resources, right, to keep everything like before. The Venetians were cleverer. In fact, thanks to that, also in Venice, there's plenty of Byzantine stuff. Famously, think about the quadriga of the circus, the beautiful art that they preserved. They shipped all the stuff. They maintain a more scientific approach to this, also because they knew Constantinople far better than the Franks, by simply the fact that Venice was technically part of the Roman Empire, right? Even if normally after the Decrees of Bulla we say, in the 11th century Venice became independent. It doesn't mean anything, right? There was a broader, even there, ambiguity, and the Venetians had always, however, been in the Eastern Mediterranean, so that they knew their place. But here the mass happens. This is like a bit the Far West, taking place. We don't have, as we were saying before, to overestimate the actual cohesion of the empire before. Of course, there was a big deal decentralization already. The Pronoia, we mentioned it for that reason, compared to the great centralized statual tradition of Roman times, let's say. We are in the Middle Ages, so lots of changes that were occurring in West were present also in Byzantine Empire, were present in the Islamic world. This tendency to feudalization was already started. But the major collapse of this system caused enormous transformations in this world. So the conquest of the Byzantine province began towards the end of 1204, and it took place more or less across the same and the following year, bringing to the constitution of some semi-independent feudal states within the body of the Latin Empire, right? So there was this fiction, imperial fiction, maintained nominally, but factually this became a feudal empire, right? And therefore there were these principalities that became de facto quasi-private possessions, let's say. So the first one is the Kingdom of Thessalonica. It was formed in 1205 by Boniface of Montferrat. with the jurisdiction over Macedonia and Thessaly. Boniface reclaimed these territories in contrast with the same Latin emperor, and he was backed in this by the Venetians that in exchange obtained from him the concession of Crete, of which they would have taken, in fact, possession some time later, factually. Then there was the Duchy of Athens. By the way, Crete was very well organized. I mean, it was basically had been the backyard of the imperial of the Komnenians. Like, Crete was like a perfect private possession of the Komnenian dynasty, very close to Constantinople. So I mean, very close in the sense of contacts, direct contacts. So the Venetians spotted that it was the major territorial acquisitions eventually that the Venetians would maintain for a long time. As we were saying before, the Venetians were mostly interested, as we'll see now, in ports, strongholds, because that's what made they were dramatically easier to control, and they just wanted that for cash and for their sea trade. They didn't need to govern large bodies of land. They avoided that explicitly. But Crete was something. Also, Venice, considered at this point, was was pretty advanced in terms of political institutional development, but still the way, as we'll see now, even some islands were occupied was private. Right? At least there was an agreement with the Republic. Some families took possession of these things because simply they roamed around with their ships, with the things, so they would seize the opportunity. They would, right, and the mess that, as we were saying, that answered 1204 was well exploited in that sense. So continuing the list, there was the Duchy of Athens, as we were saying, including Attica and Boeotia. It was formed in 1205 by the Burgundian Otto de la Roche, with the support of the King of Thessalonica. Then the Principality of Achaia and Morea in the Peloponnese was conquered in 1205 by the French Guillaume de Champlitte and Geoffroy de Villehardouin. We made a video, by the way, about it's something called medieval Greece. That was a bit of a conceptual history of late medieval, what we call Greece today. So in which we go a bit also more in detail about these entities. So if you're interested, I guess probably you'll have the video among the suggestions. But anyhow, that's just so as we were saying, the Venetians drew the greatest advantages from the conquest, and they ensured a series of commercial posts to grant the routes for the Levant, the East, as they called it. And the Venetians in this renounced expressively to the territories of continental Greece that had been formally assigned in the partition, because it was the normal business. So if they had accepted that, that dominion would have entailed implied a transformation of Venice into a terrestrial power that, as we've seen, they were not interested in. So instead, they took possession of important centers such as Dyrrhachium, Corfu, Coron, Modon in the Peloponnese, Crete, as we've seen, part of Euboea, and to these acquisitions that passed under the direct control of the Venetian Republic were added the archipelagos islands conquered in an autonomous way, as we were saying before, by some noblemen who constituted their own personal seigneuries de facto. So the number of these possessions increased over time, but at the moment of the first conquest in 1207, let's say, they had to be fundamentally Naxos, Paros, Milos, Santorini. They were occupied by Marco Sanudo and his comrades. Andros, that was taken by Marino Dandolo. Tinos, Mykonos, Skyros, Skopelos, and Skiathos. I don't know these names actually in Greek, but These ended in up in the hands of the brothers Andrea and Geremia Gysi. Also Lemnos, that fall under the rule of Filocalo Navigaios. The latter was a Venetian of the former Constantinopolitan community, as a proof that, of course, the Venetians knew where to put their hands, and were part of the quote assigned to Venice were the principal ports of Hellespont and of the Sea of Marmara, and some other possessions in Thrace, among which Adrianople, by the way, that strategically was relevant enough. And in Constantinople, the Venetians had finally part of the same city, and were reintegrated in the quarter that they had possessed in the times of Manuel Comnenus, because you know that the Venetians had this strains with the Byzantines that they didn't quite like each other, but they kind of needed each other. The Byzantines needed Venice for the fleet. The Venetians needed the Byzantines for the ports, and therefore this is normal in Mediterranean. Sometimes there were this kind of devastations of the quarters of the Latins, and then they were reinstated, and they went back and forth like that. But objectively, they had there were unscrupulous interests involved in these mechanisms. So the Venetian Doge from 1206 called himself thus Lord of the fourth and a half part of the Empire of Romania, a title that remembered his own dominion, actually in the portion of the Byzantine Empire assigned to Venice in the partition. So the fourth and a half, that would be the 3/8, right, was in fact the half of what remained, subtracting it to the total, from the total, the fourth of the Latin Emperor. Starting from 1205, after the death of the Doge Dandolo, was also established in Constantinople a Venetian podesta, fundamentally, in order to govern part of the colonial territories. Venice granted herself in this way a commercial empire and the security of traffics up to Constantinople, which was a big deal, because otherwise their influence would be up to the Otranto Strait would be at least controlled by the same Byzantines before. Now there was a continuous threat up to Constantinople herself. And the position of the Venetians within the Latin Empire was by far more solid of the one of the Crusaders, while in fact the latter were obliged to swear fealty to the Latin Emperor. The Venetian Doge, in force of the Treaty of 1204, was exempted from this duty, let's say, and the Venetian policy furthermore demonstrated itself to be more coherent of the one of the Crusaders, and also, later times Venice counterposed herself as a unitary power to the fragmentation of the Latin Empire, right? Political unity here is fundamental, and this, since the beginning, showed the typical faults of the feudal regimes with a weak central power, and the affirmation in the periphery of this entity of more or less autonomous or even antagonistic forces to the latter. So the Latin conquest, however, at the beginning was very easy, right? After the fall of Constantinople, there wasn't much, further resistance. I mean, at a structural level, right? The periphery is, yes, unifying more guerrilla, but that's exactly because the periphery counts less, right? And also there are less resources. But the reason of this was that the greatest part of the Byzantine pronoiari accepted subjugation from the new lords, and obtaining in exchange the assurance of preserving their own possessions, of course, right? And thus, it is explained the lack of resistance from the side of the indigenous element that was controlled by the great Byzantine fief holders at this point. But, however, not all the Byzantines surrendered, and some aristocrats escaped in regions that had not been reached by the Latins yet, giving life to independent governments that reclaimed the continuity with the previous empire. And the first one of these was undoubtedly the Empire of Nicaea in Asia Minor, that was founded in 1204 by Theodore Lascaris, that was the son-in-law of Alexis III, right, that had escaped from Constantinople at the moment of the Latin conquest, where they had called the Crusaders. I mean, that's how messed up the thing, right? It was actually the fall of Constantinople. It wasn't just because of the Crusaders. They were actually called there by the same Byzantines, right, to overthrow the previous regime. But we will talk more about 1204 because that's often a history told in a biased way from one side or the other, but it was actually much more logical in its cruelty than a bipartite vision of the story. Let's say that in 1208 Theodore had himself crowned Roman emperor, right, by Michael Autorianus, that had been created by himself as patriarch, right? Of course, Nicaea would at that point act as if they were parallel empire. That there was broader ambition after all. It was not much a matter of formalities. I mean, they would obviously all take on. I mean, the same Latins did the same. Or everybody wanted that chunk of imperial Roman imperial power, right? There was then, from the other side of the map, let's say, the Despotate of Epirus, with the capital Artas, the ancient Ambracia, if you know where it is, in northwestern Greece, that was constituted in 1205 by Michael Angelus, that was the cousin of Isaac II and Alexis III. To Epirus and Nicaea was also added the Empire of Trebezan on the Black Sea, that was already formed by April 1204 under the two Komnenian brothers, Alexius and David, that were grandsons of Andronicus I Comnenus, that thus reclaimed the imperial title for themselves as well. The Empire of Trebizond was the last main chunk of Byzantine Empire that would fundamentally remain even after the fall of Constantinople for a while, but there were other chunks that lived even on in the 60s, in the 70s. So that's another story, though. So Trebizond, it's the main center of the northern coast of Asia Minor. I mean, it always had kind of an autonomous ambition that here it's okay. We'll talk about it another time, but it was naturally projected on the Black Sea in the north, in the Pontic side, so Trebizond kept having an autonomous life with its own sovereigns, right? The imperial power had always sought to keep Trebizond more kind of within the continental dimension of Asia Minor, to boost the internal communications and stability within the heartland, right before it was lost to the Turks. And now instead, Trebizond was free, and it revealed its more autonomous ambitions. Right, a few centers could do that. Thessalonica had tried it too, but it was too close to Constantinople to escape it. It was sucked in at the end of the day. So Trebizond sovereigns, as we were saying before, would remain up to the Turkish conquest in the 15th century. In Asia Minor, however, there were other independent Greek principalities held by magnates, but let's say of lesser extension and also, let's be honest, of scarce importance from a political point of view. The Empire of Nicaea was the major power. It was unfruitfully contrasted by the Latins that, however, intended to conquer it in order to get rid of, in this way, of a obviously potential threat of Byzantine restoration, as it would happen. So it was normal to do. They were just from the other side of the sea. So at the end of 1204, the Latins attacked Asia Minor in order to conquer Nicaea. But their advance was, abruptly stopped when, in February 1205, the Byzantines of Thrace rebelled, calling into their help the Bulgarian Tsar Kaloyan. So at this point, the Latin emperor called back his army from Asia Minor, and from Constantinople he moved against the enemies. On April 14th, 1205, the main battle at close to Adrianople was fought, where Baldwin was bloodily defeated by the Bulgarians. We'll talk about this battle in the battle videos, let's say, at some point, because it's interesting. So today we don't cover that. But naturally, it's worth mentioning that in the Battle of Adrianople perished the flower of the Crusader cavalry. That naturally constituted the main political, strategical, asset of the empire. Right, the same emperor disappeared in a sense because he was made prisoner and he would never be released. The survivors, guided by the Doge Dandolo and by Geoffroy de Villehardouin, that, by the way, is the same guy, the same historian of the Crusade that we mention often, the homonymous nephew of the Achaean prince, and they reached, with difficulties, Constantinople, and many, seized by panic, abandoned the empire to come back home in Western Europe. So in practice, as we were saying before, the Battle of Adrianople saved Nicaea from the likely, at least, subjugation of the Westerners that had to temporarily evacuate Asia Minor. The Empire of Nicaea managed, therefore, to consolidate and to collect the legacy of Constantinople. Theodore Lascaris organized the new state on the Byzantine model, in everything, of course, making relieve both the empire and the patriarchate. He and his successors also entered history, let's say, as sovereigns of Constantinople, as a sort of imperial government in exile, right? Didactically speaking, that's what this continuity is stressed. In fact, if we consider the series of Nicaean governors as let's say, the legitimate succession of Alexius V after the fall of the capital, right? This is understandable. To the empire, the Latin Empire and the Latin Patriarch were thus counterposed an Orthodox Patriarch and a Greek Emperor in Nicaea. Nicaea represented a danger for the Latin Empire. The new title holder of this, Henry of Flanders, who was Baldwin's brother, resumed the plan of subjugating Nicaea after having stopped the Bulgarian expansion. So war went on for some years without particular achievements until in 1214 the Treaty of Nymphaeum was concluded, not to be confused with the one of 1265, with basically the reestablishing of the empire in Constantinople, that defined properly the boundaries of the two empires. So to the Latin Empire would have remained the northwestern coast of Asia Minor, while the rest up to the Seljuk frontier in the hinterland would have gone to Nicaea. So this treaty is important because by it the Latins recognized the existence of the Greek Empire in Asia Minor, since they hadn't managed to eliminate it with arms. In the meanwhile, the Despotate of Epirus in turn rose rapidly as a considerable power, because they began to extend over the same Epirus, Acarnania, Aetolia, and basically as Nicaea, it reached it assumed a very strong anti-Latin political position. The most spectacular success against the Latins was obtained by the despot Theodore Angelus in 1217, when the Epirothian forces made prisoner Peter of Courtenay, that was the designed emperor of Constantinople, that was traveling to assume the title. In 1224, furthermore, Theodore Angelus reconquered Thessalonica as well. That, as we've seen, was the second largest city in the empire, and put in an end to the Latin reign there that had been maintained by the successors of Boniface of Montferrat, that was killed by the Bulgarians in 1207, and this allowed Theodore Angelus to ensure himself the dominion over Thessaly and great part of Macedonia. After this success, he had himself equally, just like the Nicaeans, proclaimed Emperor of the Romans, claiming the right to represent the continuity of the Byzantine government, in fact, antagonistically to Nicaea, with which Epirus, in fact, had a constant relation of rivalry anyway. In 1225, the center of the Latin Empire had thus shrunk to the sole Constantinople, right, and to its suburbs, without direct communications with the periphery, and it seemed on the point of falling in the hands of the Emperor of Thessalonica, but it managed to survive still for some other year, mostly predictably for the mistakes of and the contrasts of the enemies, that because of its own capacities at that point had been sensibly reduced. Alright, so we'll talk back another time about properly the Palaiologan coming back on the Constantinopolitan throne. That's another chapter. So for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.